What is up, fantasy fans? As always, I'm Shay from the channel Zachary Shay, and today I want to do a versus video. This will be the first in a series of videos where I compare two series that I think are doing something similar and are kind of in conversation with one another. And for the first episode, I'm going to do the Edan Trilogy by Philip Chase and Malazan Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson. Now, let me just explain what the video is. This is the first one. So what we're not doing here is comparing which one to see which one's better. I think anyone who knows me knows that Malazan Book of the Fallen is one of my favorite series, if not my favorite series of all time. And if I were to say which of these I prefer more, I would say Malazan, but I love them both dearly. And I know people personally that bounced off Malazan and love Edan, and bounced off Edan but love Malazan. This is not to compare which series is better, because I think they both accomplish different things. Though if I were pressed, I would say Malazan would be my favorite of the two, but I love them both. And I'm also not here to say that the Edan trilogy borrowed from Malazan Book of the Fallen, because to my knowledge, I believe Philip Chase wrote this trilogy, at least 2/3 of the trilogy, before even reading Gardens of the Moon, and I believe he had the whole thing outlined before he finished Malazan. But I know for certain that Way and Prophet of Edan were both completely written, though, you know, there were revisions and stuff, but they were written prior to him ever even touching Gardens of the Moon, to my knowledge. Don't quote me on that, but I believe that's the case. That being said, I believe that there are quite a few similarities, both character-wise, thematically, but it is more of a correlative factor and less of a causative factor. I'm not here to say like, oh, Philip Chase got this from Malazan. I think it's more so that two men that have a similar worldview, anyone who knows Philip Chase, they know that Malazan's his favorite series of all time. I'm not saying that he took things from Malazan Book of the Fallen. I'm saying these two men, similar worldview, it would make sense for Malazan to be his favorite series, because I think they're both saying similar things, and they're both saying quite a few different things, and we'll get into that. Now, a lot of people compare this series, the Edan trilogy, very heavily with Lord of the Rings, and I understand that comparison. Aesthetically, they seem very similar. They're both borrowing from a lot of the same resources, to include Beowulf and the Volsung Saga, which I have not read, so I probably shouldn't speak on too much, but I hope to rectify that soon. But they're borrowing from a lot of the same thing. You have dwergs, you have elves, you have dwarfs, you have elves. But in terms of what these two works are saying, okay, so you could make the argument that these, along with Tolkien, are discussing entropy, how as time goes on, things dissolve into a greater level of chaos, but that's not really what we're here to examine right now. I don't even know why I mentioned that. But a lot of people compare this to Tolkien. I think thematically it has more in common with Malazan. At least that's where I sit right now. And I also want to establish that this is just my interpretation of the text. My interpretation is not a perfect interpretation. I can't even tell you that it is an accurate interpretation of the text, but this is what I got out of it. Now, both of these books, the thing that aligns them in my mind and makes them so similar is reading both of these series made me think of a John Donne poem that I read. The first time I came across this was when I was reading Ernest Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls. And it says, "Ponder not to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee." And what this is saying is, when the cathedral would sound the bells to say that someone had perished, that someone in that community had died. We as human beings, we are creatures that form relationships. It's natural for us our first instinct to be like, I hope it's not someone I know. And obviously, you're going to rather it be a stranger than your brother. You're going to rather it be that curmudgeon-y relative you don't see all that often versus your best friend or your wife or your child. And that's human nature. That's normal. But that poem is trying to get across, don't ponder for whom the bell tolls, because any loss of human life is a loss and you should treat it equally. Now, that's easier said than done, but both of these works to me make statements about compassion for our fellow man, empathy for our fellow man. Not saying that your faith in humanity should eclipse those of, the individual, the people in your life that are important, but I believe both works are saying that you have to put faith in your fellow man, and you have to care about your fellow man. It starts with each person empathizing and having a big, trigger word from Malazan that Malazan fans love to say all the time is compassion. I think that they're taking some quotes in Malazan and really running with them. But this is a series where compassion is very a very core concept. But I'd say both of these works are very steeped in empathy for your fellow man, not just thematically. I guess some people like to say, are you a plot-driven reader? Are you a character-driven reader? Are you a theme-driven reader? I think that's all malarkey, because your character should carry the plot. The plot should develop the characterization, and all of this should service your themes. Now, that being said, two protagonists in this series, specifically the protagonist of Gardens and the protagonist of the Edan trilogy, it can kind of get a little muddled when you speak about who is the overall protagonist of Malazan Book of the Fallen. But for this video, I'm strictly talking about Dayraven and Ganos Paran. Now, if you want to go into these books with absolutely no knowledge, I would stop the video now, but I'm not going to go into spoilers anything beyond the first few chapters of book 1. I'm not going to give away the ending to Malazan or give away the ending to the Edan trilogy. But if you're the type of person that likes to go in knowing absolutely nothing, I will be discussing some minor details. But in my opinion, they don't verge into full spoilers. They're more spoilers vague. But there's actually a lot of similarities between Ganos Paran and Dayraven of the Mark. You can see in the prologue of Gardens, but also in the earlier chapters of the Edan trilogy, that both of these boys have a sort of idolized version of war in their mind. Both of them see it as this honorable thing. Dayraven to fight for the Mark, Ganos Paran to win honor and to do great in battle. And they both see these things as noble causes. And both of them are very young, and they both come from a place of ignorance, and they both are met with death. I think that there's a lot that these characters share, but both of them die very early on within the books, within each of their series. This is very, very early on in the books. They die within the first 5 chapters of each book, I believe, and they return. And they do not return the same. I think that's very important in both of these works, that death is not something to be brushed aside, that to go through something like this will alter you. And that is true for both Ganos and for Dayraven. And it alters them in drastically different ways. That's a lot of where the character diverges there. But a lot of the naivete and how that worldview clashes with their, premature demise, and then post their demise being brought back for a purpose. Each of them is brought back for a purpose. You have Ganos rising to, that goes a little bit beyond book 1, but he's brought back for a purpose. And then you have Dayraven getting brought back by the Elf Shard. Both of these characters are people that live their lives and go about their tasks for the betterment of others. And neither one is infallible. In fact, there's many characters in Malazan that embody the whole idea of self-sacrifice for others, not just your own people. Dayraven, at the beginning of this book, he's very fond of his people in the Mark, and he is still viewing the world in terms of these lines we draw on the map, in terms of nation versus nation. And that's something that gets challenged throughout this series. People like Animander Rake in Malazan, you can see him as this beacon for his people, the Tistiandi or the Taistandi, but it goes much more than that. And his respect for life goes well beyond the confines of his own race, his own people. And that's where you get into the empathy and the compassion here. They both examine that very, very well. But let's look at some other elements. The world building. So the world building in Malazan is very distinct. Malazan world building when you see it. You can see in other works that try to mimic Malazan world building, and very few, in my mind, can capture just what makes this perfect. Whereas in the Edan trilogy, the world building elements are where I see a lot more of the Tolkien comparisons versus the Malazan ones. Character and theme wise, there's a lot more comparisons to be had with Malazan. The world building elements, this feels Tolkien-esque in a way, but the world of Eormenland is anything but a Tolkien clone. It very much has its own lore, has its own histories, much like Tolkien and like Erickson. Philip Chase is an author that is trying to build his own mythology within his world. There's a lot of history here, and it doesn't always exist solely to serve the plot. I get the feeling from this book that a lot more history was written down, but it was pared back for whatever histories tied in thematically with what events were going on within this trilogy. But I would imagine there's more songs and more history that was written that was not released within this trilogy. I would imagine, but that's mainly conjecture on my point. But both of these books do world building really, really well. There is a church, the Church of Edan in this book. There's plenty of factions within Malazan that are similar to the Church of Edan. They may have more nefarious intentions than they are letting on. To stay spoilers free still, there is a faction within Reaper's Gale, the Lethiri, that are very much like the Church of Edan, have a lot of nefarious planning and a lot of malignant intentions that the people may not be aware of, or they might be misguided. And it shows how the corruption of both church and state, differently in each book, can impact people of a nation and how they view their neighbors and how they view themselves and that nation's own sense of self. So another thing that I want to talk about, and kind of falls under world building as well, is the use of magic in these books. The Edan trilogy has this very Buddhist-like magic. Every single time that magic is implemented within this series, there's this ethereal sort of shift of consciousness to where whoever is using the magic becomes one with the world and sees the world in a way that is less tied to the individual. I think that magic very much serves the core themes of this book. Likewise, in Malazan Book of the Fallen, so you have warrens. The magic is kind of all over the place. There's tons of different magic systems, tons of different forms of magic and sorcery that are within these pages. And each series in Malazan, whether that be Carcanus, the Book of the Fallen, novels of the Malazan Empire is kind of using the same magic, but the magic grows and evolves as the world does. And a lot of the time, I realized this in a discussion with Alex Banks, that the warrens used a lot of times reflect the wielder thematically, if not always. Like the Talon are a very quick to rile people, so their warren is flame. The Jagut are a very cold and reserved people, so their warren is ice. Getting back to some of the similarities here, another thing that I thought I could see a conversation between this series and this series, between the Edan trilogy and Malazan Book of the Fallen. There is a violent action, there are many violent actions, that occurs within this series where a character who is heinous, who is unforgivable, is done violence by another character that is despicable, but the character that is the victim of this violence is by far a worse person. Pretty, if not irredeemable, he makes a case for being irredeemable. And, you know, in a less practiced storyteller shoes, like let's say Quentin Tarantino, who I actually enjoy his movies, a lot of his violence within his movies is supposed to feel cathartic as we're taking on Nazis and racists and all these objectively despicable human beings. And, you know, younger me, I really enjoyed those films, and it allowed me to get a little desensitized to violence. Malazan's doing something very different here. A lot of people will fist bump and say witness when this character is brutally dispatched. A lot of people will cheer, and I will admit that I was one of them. It's hard not to when this character is so vile. But if you actually pay attention to the work, Erikson is not endorsing, at least in my opinion, as I read this book, as I perceived what Erikson was saying, and especially as I perceived in his follow-up series, Witness, you're not supposed to cheer at those moments. Like, yes, he did write this knowing that people would cheer, but his follow-up series, Witness, is in a lot of ways responding to that, saying, okay, but like, what were you wanting us to witness? Because this is some pretty despicable stuff going on. And I don't know, I personally, when I think about the victim if you've read Malazan, you know what scene I'm talking about. I myself, when I think of the victim of that violence, I still admittedly think that he deserved every bit of it. but I also don't think it's something to cheer for. And that could be a failing on my own character, to look at another human and be like, yes, you deserve this terrible, violent dispatching, this killing. But, you know, I don't know. I believed his actions were beyond redemption, but that is not for me to say. And Philip Chase, in his book, really, this occurs within his third book. There's a character that is, while not quite as despicable as the specific someone found within these pages, does some pretty despicable things, and is very hard to see him as redeemable. But Philip Chase actually tries to show you his redemption and shows you, almost through pity, the humanity of this character. And I thought it was really, really, really well done. And I felt, even though I probably am wrong about this, I actually don't know if he had read that section of Malazan yet, but to me, at least the soul of the conversation in this book was in response to some of the things explored here. And that, is it okay for us to feel some catharsis at the loss of humanity there? And you know, this is a character that is pretty despicable, and in the moment you're thinking like, oh, okay, yeah, you're getting what you deserve, and then it goes a step further, and it's very hard for you not to feel for this character. Likewise, there's another character within this book that is the epitome of evil, that is vile as the character from this series that I was talking about. And you know, when that character also gets their comeuppance in a way, it doesn't really feel cathartic. It doesn't. You're still questioning what could have been, and if redemption was possible. And I hope I haven't journeyed too far into spoilers, but all that is to say, I think both books are trying to have a conversation on what redemption looks like when you're past that point, and if you can be past that point, if anyone's past that point. Both books are very, very concerned with empathy for our fellow man, and how far that empathy reaches, and how much value we can put in a human life. So yeah, that is my first versus video between the Edan trilogy and Malazan Book of the Fallen. Thanks, guys. Peace.